At exactly 6:30 in the morning, my phone started ringing. I almost ignored it. It was too early, and I had barely slept. But when I saw my sister Sarah's name on the screen, something inside me told me to answer. Hello? For 3 seconds, there was complete silence. Then Sarah whispered, "You need to listen carefully." My heart started racing. What happened? She took a shaky breath. Dad died last night. I sat straight up in bed. What? Dad died, she repeated. He passed away during the night. I couldn't speak. My father had been sick for a while, but the last time I talked to him, he sounded stronger. He had even joked about fixing the old garden fence when I visited him that weekend. Are you sure? I finally asked. Sarah's voice became strangely cold. There's nothing to be confused about. He's gone. I wiped my eyes, trying to understand what I was hearing. Then she said something that made my grief turn into confusion. And before you start asking questions, Dad left everything to me. I froze. What do you mean? The house. His savings. His investments. Everything. But Dad never told me that. He didn't have to. Her answer was so confident that it made me uncomfortable. Can I come over? I asked. No. The answer came immediately. Why not? Because there's nothing for you here. I'll take care of the funeral arrangements. You should just accept that Dad is gone and move on. Then she ended the call. I sat there staring at my phone. My father was dead. At least, that was what my sister wanted me to believe. But something didn't feel right. I called Dad's phone. No answer. I called again. Nothing. Then I remembered the security cameras around his house. Dad had installed them after someone broke into a nearby home. He had once shown me the camera app on his phone. With shaking hands, I opened it. The camera connected. And there he was. My father. Alive. Sitting in his favorite chair. I nearly dropped my phone. Dad? His head slowly turned toward the camera. A few seconds later, his phone rang. I watched him answer. Hello? Dad. There was silence. Are you okay? I asked. His expression immediately changed. What happened? I swallowed. Sarah called me this morning. His face tightened. What did she say? She told me you died. My father stared at the screen. Then I said the words that made his expression completely change. She also said you left everything to her. For several seconds, Dad said nothing. Then he quietly whispered, "She told you I was dead?" Yes. He leaned back in his chair. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was completely different. Don't call her. I froze. Why? Because I want to hear what she says next. I drove to Dad's house as quickly as I could. The entire way there, I kept replaying Sarah's words in my head. Dad died last night. Everything belongs to me. You get nothing. But none of it made sense anymore. When I reached the house, Dad was standing by the front door. The moment I saw him, I nearly cried. I hugged him so tightly that he laughed. I thought I lost you. He patted my shoulder. Apparently, I'm harder to get rid of than your sister thought. The joke made me smile for half a second. Then I looked at him. What happened? Dad's smile disappeared. He invited me inside and told me everything. Sarah had visited him the previous evening. She brought several documents and told him they were routine papers that needed his signature. But Dad noticed that the papers were related to his property. He refused to sign them. That was when Sarah became angry. She told him that she had spent years taking care of him and deserved the house. Dad looked at me. I told her that taking care of your father doesn't mean you own him. Sarah stormed out. Then, at 6:30 the next morning, she called me. Dad's voice became quiet. She wanted you to believe I was dead before you could speak to me. I felt sick. Why would she do that? Because she knew I would tell you the truth. Suddenly, all those strange moments from the past made sense. Sarah had always asked about Dad's bank accounts. She wanted to know how much the house was worth. She had even asked me once whether Dad planned to change his will. Back then, I thought she was simply being practical. Now I realized she had been planning for the day Dad was gone. Except she didn't want to wait for that day. She wanted control while he was still alive. Dad sat quietly for a moment. Then he picked up his phone. I'm calling her. I stared at him. Are you sure? He nodded. I want to hear her lie to me. He called Sarah and put the phone on speaker. She answered almost immediately. Dad? Dad said nothing. Hello? Finally, he spoke. Sarah, I need you to come over. There was a pause. Why? Because we need to talk. Her voice suddenly became nervous. Dad, you shouldn't be making decisions right now. You're confused. I looked at Dad. His eyebrows lifted. Confused? Yes, she said quickly. You're not thinking clearly. Dad gave me a look. Then he calmly asked, Sarah, did you tell my daughter that I died? Silence. I could hear her breathing. Then she whispered. What? Dad repeated the question. And this time, there was nowhere left for her to hide. No, I didn't, Sarah said immediately. Dad looked at me. Then he calmly replied, you also told her that I left everything to you. I never said that. Dad's expression became colder. Sarah, I heard the entire conversation. Silence. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then her voice broke. Dad. I was scared. Scared of what? I thought you were going to leave me with nothing. Dad closed his eyes. You already had something. What? A father who loved you. Sarah started crying. But Dad didn't stop. You were so focused on what I might leave behind that you forgot I was still here. I felt tears in my own eyes. Dad told her to come over that afternoon. When Sarah arrived, she clearly expected to find an old, confused father she could control. Instead, she found me sitting beside him. Her face went pale. Dad placed a folder on the table. What's that? She asked. Your documents. He opened the folder. Inside were copies of every paper she had tried to get him to sign. Then he placed another document on the table. His updated will. Sarah stared at it. Dad. I changed my will this morning. She looked at me. Did she convince you to do this? Dad shook his head. No one convinced me. But you promised. I promised you nothing. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Then she said something that I will never forget. I was the one who stayed. Dad looked directly at her. And she was the one who called me every night. Sarah became silent. Dad continued. You counted visits. She counted conversations. That sentence seemed to break through her anger. For the first time, I realized what this had really been about. Sarah didn't simply want the house. She wanted proof that she mattered more. And somehow, she had turned our father's love into a competition. Eventually, she admitted everything. She had assumed the house would become hers. When Dad refused to sign the documents, she panicked. She thought that if I believed Dad was dead, she could control everything before I arrived. She planned to tell me that Dad had made a final decision before his death. But there was one problem. Dad wasn't dead. And now the truth was sitting right in front of her. Why didn't you just ask me? Dad asked. Sarah looked down. Because I knew you would choose her. Dad shook his head. No. Sarah looked up. You were competing with your sister when there was never a competition. Nobody spoke. Then Sarah turned toward me. I'm sorry. I didn't forgive her immediately. Because trust doesn't return just because someone says sorry. So I told her what Dad had taught me years earlier. You don't repair trust by saying you're sorry. You repair it by behaving differently when nobody is watching. Sarah nodded. Then she left. But Dad had one final decision to make. And none of us knew how much it would change our family. A few days later, Dad called both of us back to his house. I expected another argument. Instead, he handed us 2 envelopes. Inside mine was a letter Dad had written years earlier. It said that whatever happened to his money or property, he wanted his children to remember one thing. Nothing he owned was worth losing each other over. Then Dad told us what he had decided. He was selling the house. Neither of us would receive it. The money would be placed into a trust for his future care, and whatever remained would eventually be divided equally between us. Sarah looked shocked. After everything I did, you're still giving me half? Dad smiled sadly. I'm not rewarding what you did. He pointed toward the documents. I'm protecting what I spent my life building. Then he looked at both of us. And I refused to let my final years become another fight over money. That was Dad's revenge. He didn't destroy Sarah. He didn't humiliate her. He simply removed money from the center of our relationship. And suddenly, there was nothing left for her to fight over. Things weren't magically perfect after that. For months, Sarah and I barely spoke. Trust takes much longer to rebuild than it takes to break. But Dad kept inviting us both over. Sometimes we ate dinner together. Sometimes we argued. Sometimes we simply sat in silence. Slowly, things started changing. Sarah began visiting Dad without asking about his finances. She brought groceries. She helped around the house. And one evening, while Dad was asleep, she came to me. I really thought he loved you more, she whispered. I looked at her. He didn't. She wiped her eyes. I know that now. I didn't know what to say. So I hugged her. Not because everything was forgotten. But because maybe this was the beginning of something better. Dad eventually became strong enough to walk around the neighborhood again. Whenever someone asked how he was doing, he would smile and say, apparently, I'm still alive. We would laugh. But I never forgot that morning. 6:30 a.m. One phone call. One terrible lie. And one truth that changed everything. My sister thought she could erase my father from the story before I had the chance to hear his side. Instead, her lie exposed exactly why he could no longer trust her with his future. And the biggest revenge wasn't taking anything away from her. It was refusing to let her greed destroy what was left of our family. Years later, I still think about that phone call. Sometimes betrayal doesn't come from a stranger. Sometimes it comes from someone who knows exactly where your heart is weakest. My sister thought money would give her security. Instead, it almost cost her a father. And Dad taught me something I will never forget. People who truly love you don't make you compete for their love. They don't measure affection in houses, bank accounts, or inheritance. And sometimes the strongest revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it is simply letting the truth stand in the light. Because lies can control people for a while. But eventually, the truth walks into the room. And when it does, everyone hears it.